My name is Duplantis, and I'm going to be the instructor for today's training session. Unfortunately, I'm not able to meet with you in person, but this video presentation will be more than good enough for the purpose intended. Also, I'll be available afterwards for conference calls to answer any questions. Today we're going to be talking about hydrogen sulfide in the workplace, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so today we're going to be covering a few different topics. We're going to start off with an overview of hydrogen sulfide. We're going to talk about some of the effects it has on the body, some of the symptoms you should look for, an emergency response that you should follow in the presence of H2S gases, some of the ways it enters the body, and also we're going to cover the threshold limit value, the permissible exposure limit, and the recommended exposure limits. Okay, so to start off, hydrogen sulfide is also known as H2S. It's a colorless gas, and it's also described as a rotten egg smell in some lower concentrations. The reason it's so dangerous is because it's highly flammable and also highly toxic. Hydrogen sulfide is one of the leading causes of workplace gas inhalation deaths in the United States, and this is according to the BLS. It can be found in a number of industries, to name a few: oil and gas refinery, mining, and also pulp and paper processing. So why is this chemical deadly? First of all, its molecules are heavier than air, so it'll sink down and it'll build up in confined areas. So any confined area is going to be a lot more dangerous. And also at a certain concentration level, the smell, you get used to it, so you can't smell it anymore, which makes it extremely dangerous also. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the effects of H2S gas. Some of the routes of entry are inhalation or skin or eye contact, and at the lower levels you're really going to be experiencing some of the eye irritation symptoms, and the more you progress up the concentration levels, the more serious symptoms you're going to see, and at the highest levels that's when unconsciousness happens and even death. This chemical is labeled as an irritant, and once it does get into the system, it's going to target the eyes, the respiratory system, and the central nervous system. People with asthma are going to be more sensitive at lower concentrations, and like I said, the effects depend on the exposure level and the level of concentrations. Emergency response. As a rule, if you smell H2S gas and you don't know how much is in the air, you want to leave the area right away. You never want to use your smell as a testing mechanism if H2S is present, because at certain levels you can't smell the chemical anymore. You only want to return when it's been measured and found safe, and only experienced personnel should be using approved tools and monitors to test the areas where it was present. Some of the minor symptoms is eye irritation, and if you have these symptoms, you want to seek first aid as soon as possible. Flush your eyes out with lukewarm water immediately and at least for 30 minutes. And if symptoms are still present, then you want to seek a doctor as soon as possible. Okay, so here we have some of the symptoms that occur with exposure to H2S gas. Listed we have eye irritation, eye pain, lacrimation, which is a discharge of tears, photophobia, which is an abnormal intolerance to light, dizziness, headaches, lassitude, which is weakness and exhaustion, irritability and insomnia, and also the last one, H2S can also be in a liquid form, and with exposure to the liquid form, you can also have some frostbite. Okay, so here we have the chart that I mentioned earlier that describes the concentrations and the associated symptoms. In the left-hand column we have the concentration, that's in parts per million, and on the right-hand column we have the associated symptoms. So it's important to notice that, with lower levels you don't have the serious consequences, but as it builds up, you get more and more symptoms, and eventually at high enough levels you have the death. So I'm just going to go over a few of the concentration levels and their associated symptoms. So from 0.01 to 0.15 you have the odor threshold, and that's when you can smell the rotten egg smell. At 100 parts per million, that's when you have the coughing and eye irritation, and then at around 150 parts per million is when you're going to have the loss of smell. You won't be able to smell the presence of the gas anymore. And then from 700 to 1,000 parts per million, you have rapid unconsciousness, and within 1 to 2 breaths, you stop breathing, and that's when the death occurs. And then anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 parts per million, you have near instant death. So that's extremely high concentrations. But basically, like I said, at lower concentrations, you just have some of the eye irritation and nausea and headaches and stuff. And then as you progress up the parts per million, you get some of the more serious consequences. Permissible exposure limits. This is the limit set by OSHA to protect workers against health effects of exposure to hazardous gases. This is enforceable by OSHA, and it's broken down into two different formulas. There's an 8-hour time-weighted average, which is a TWA, and there's also a ceiling and peak limits. For H2S gases, the permissible exposure limit is 20 parts per million, and that's the ceiling limit. And then there's also the 50 parts per million peak limit. And then the peak limit can only be reached for up to 10 minutes and if there's no other exposure during the shift. And if you go back to the chart in the previous slide, at the concentration of 20 parts per million, you're going to experience some possible fatigue, headaches, irritability, and some dizziness. It should also be noted that OSHA sets the TWA, the time-weighted average for H2S gas in the construction industry and the shipyard industry for 10 parts per million. Recommended exposure limit. This limit is set by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. They believe that this is the level that should be implemented to protect workers in the workplace. And according to their institute, the H2S gas recommended exposure limit is 10 parts per million. Threshold limit value. This is the value set by the American Conference of the Governmental Industrial Hygienists, and it's their guidelines for workplace exposure to toxic substances. TLVs are developed and designed to function as recommendations for the control of health hazards. And the ACGIH recommends the threshold limit value of 1 part per million for the TWA, which is the time-weighted average, and also a short-term exposure limit of 5 ppm. And this is for the exposure of H2S gas. And if you notice that this threshold limit value is lower than the recommended exposure limit and the permissible exposure limit. Like I said, they adopted this new threshold in 2010, and it's going to be implemented and recommended to a lot of industry. This concludes my presentation on hydrogen sulfide safety. Remember, H2S can be very dangerous. If you think H2S is present in an area, leave immediately and report it. Always seek medical attention when necessary, and don't return to an area unless it's safe. The best countermeasure is to stay informed and educated, so I would like to thank you all for participating in this presentation, and please inform me if you have any questions.